Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Katheryn Russ, a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and a professor of economics at the University of California, Davis, who worked for the Obama administration's Council of Economic Advisors as senior economist for international trade and finance. She's a faculty research associate in the National Bureau of Economic Research International Trade and Investment Group, and she has been a visiting scholar at the central banks of Germany, Portugal, and France, and the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis and San Francisco. And she has an article at CNN, Republicans Are Playing with Fire. Welcome to Background Briefing, Katheryn Russ.
Thank you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us, Katheryn. And your article comes out at an important moment. Of course, the U.S. Will default on its debt as early as July or perhaps even earlier. But we have an example of what you're writing about in terms of warning us about the consequences. There have been pictures seen around the world of the Chinese official Wang Yi brokering a peace between the Saudi Arabians and the Iranians. And this is a big diplomatic win for China. And to some extent, I don't know whether you could call it a black eye for the United States, but it certainly marginalizes the United States. So this is a precursor, is it not, of what would happen if we default on our debt, which would be a massive self-inflicted wound to our national security. And as you point out in your article, it would be a huge win for Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping.
Well, I think that peace anywhere is a win for everyone. And the White House statement on this agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia really underscored that. So, to the degree that President Xi is contributing to that, we have to consider that a plus for the world, including the United States. But you're absolutely right. This threat of default really plays into a very strong campaign by Putin, by Xi, to portray the United States as a source of injustice and chaos in the world broadly. So it creates a national security threat for us where really none should exist.
And in terms of earlier reports of Xi's visit to Saudi Arabia and statements from Mohammed bin Salman, they're toying with the idea that they will no longer pay for oil in dollars, and dollars are the reserve currency and give the United States a huge advantage. That, again, would be a casualty of a default, would it not?
Absolutely. So we've seen a very gradual erosion of the dominance of the dollar in global transactions over the past few decades. Barry Eichengreen has documented that in the Journal of International Economics. But it's been a very gradual thing, and the dollar is still, by a large margin, the dominant currency in global transactions. And so what I mean by that is exactly what you're describing. So oil, for instance, is priced in dollars for most transactions in the world. Many transactions between countries that don't use the dollar as their domestic currency, they price their import and export contracts, their cross-border loan contracts in dollars. Why is that? Partly because people have so much faith in the dollar, and a lot of that is supported by their faith in U.S. Treasury securities, which are denominated in dollars and very important in official reserve holdings of dollars that countries keep on hand in case there's a crisis.
So, given that we'll be stiffing a lot of China, for example, I think China sold off a bunch of its U.S. treasuries at the end of 2022. But we're not only stiffing China, we would be stiffing Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan to the tune of about $2 trillion. And other allies, Australia, Canada, France, Great Britain, and Germany, of $1 trillion in terms of the treasuries that they hold. So explain to us the whole point of what U.S. treasuries mean and why people buy them.
People buy them because they know. So if a bond, so a treasury bond is an IOU. It means that you lend the United States money right now and we'll pay you back in the future. And so because people have so much confidence that we'll pay them back, it's the premier safe asset for the world. So countries maintain maintain precautionary holdings of dollars. If something goes awry, they want to be able to have a reserve. They hold those reserves in the form of U.S. Treasury securities and other dollar-denominated assets. So if we default on these, that would really erode the popularity of the dollar-denominated assets, but especially U.S. Treasury securities as the world's premier safe asset. And that means that it will become less liquid. It will become less popular to buy and sell and to use to index contracts for cross-border transactions. Again, like imports, exports, cross-border loans.
And another point that you make in your article at CNN, Katheryn Russ, Republicans Are Playing with Fire, is that one of the most useful tools now in geopolitics, short of military action, which, given the nuclear powers around the world, it's more often than not restrained, although we do have a war going on in Ukraine, and there have been nuclear threats coming from Putin. In a curious way, he's using nuclear threats as a shield behind which he conducts a conventional war. But nevertheless, if you default, you undermine the US's best weapon, which is freezing assets of rogue regimes like Russia. And for example, the European banks alone are holding, I think, about $500 billion in Russian assets, which would probably be used to reconstruct Ukraine, assuming that there's some kind of a peace deal and then this terrible war ends. So elaborate on that, if you will, because that to me is a really important point.
Absolutely. The dollar's dominance is what makes U.S. sanctions so powerful. We can almost entirely shut down a country's transactions with the rest of the world because most of them are denominated in dollars. And this has been a very powerful force in making Russia feel some impact domestically from its choice to invade the Ukraine. It's also been a very powerful weapon in the past in bringing Iran to the negotiating table on nuclear arrangements. Although I know there are vicissitudes in that long and ongoing process, but it's still been a key mechanism to gain leverage. It cannot be overstated. I mean, if you think about China and Taiwan, and China, whatever hesitancy that China has to invade Taiwan, may be in part because of the threat of sanctions like Russia faced. So the dominance of the dollar as a national security protection, it can't be understated. And if people lose their confidence in the dollar because we stop paying back U.S. Treasury bonds, wow, that would just be such an unforced error. It would play exactly into Xi and Putin's hands. Absolutely.
So walk us through then, Katheryn, what would happen if international investors got out of dollars? Wouldn't they turn to China?
Maybe, maybe not. So the renminbi is becoming an alternative currency. So if you look at that work by Barry Eichengreen, he does show that use of the renminbi is increasing relative to the dollar. It's still limited because Beijing largely controls most transactions in foreign exchange markets. So if you want to exchange renminbi for other stuff, you often have to go through official channels, official clearinghouses that are located in countries around the world. There are pools of renminbi that are held in completely private settings where they can be exchanged without, government oversight or intervention, but it's still pretty tightly controlled. The renminbi isn't. It's hard to imagine it as being positioned for immediate ascension, but certainly it would be. Its strength as an alternative would rise, no question about it, if the confidence in the dollar were undermined by a default like the one that's being threatened on the national debt right now, which is composed of U.S. Treasury bonds.
But wouldn't the world turn to China in terms of supply chains? I mean, we've already had that problem through COVID, and wouldn't that come back with a vengeance?
Well, The relationship to supply chains is more is probably more one of confidence. So while the US is trying to pursue a strategy of friendshoring, it really has to induce other countries to invest in beefing up their supply chain relationships with the United States. So investment always takes some confidence in what's going to happen in the future. If the United States is welching out on its most basic promise to pay people back what they promised to pay them already, like with their IOUs, these bonds, that would really undermine any kind of influence the US might have in negotiations to promote friendshoring, to promote any kind of redirection and strengthening of resilience of supply chains.
But we need new investments, do we not, for new energy, etc.?
Yeah, any shift in supply chains to make them more resilient or more reliable, or to redirect them toward allies, would require new investment. That's a long-term venture. It's a risk that people take. You can't just start producing stuff. You have to create factories or other kinds of facilities to set up these supply chains. So asking people to engage in these long-term risks when we can't even maintain our most basic core promises to repay our national debt when they hold our bonds, that is just, yeah, I think that would really, really hurt our ability to redirect any kind of supply chains or enhance their resilience in the hands of allied nations.
So let's talk then about the GOP's weaponization of our debt, which of course, as you made clear, will do untold damage to our credibility and our ability to fulfill our commitments. We also have this battle over the budget, which President Biden announced his budget on Thursday. There's a sort of a game going on where McCarthy, the speaker, says, let's talk about it. And Biden obviously wants him to go public and publish a budget, saying, well, show me your, it's almost like that movie, show me your money. So that seems to be going on, and it's hard to know the extent to which budgets are political documents or economic documents, or where one begins and the other ends. But that's clearly what's happening now. I guess what you're arguing is the time is now to raise taxes and cut spending and get real, right?
Well, if people are serious about deficit reduction, that's the only way to do it, to raise revenues and cut spending. That's the case in any business, any organization. It's the same for the United States. We can't escape that. This is the hard work of governance, negotiating budget priorities, negotiating these final allocations and tax rates. You just really can't escape that by threatening to default on the national debt. I mean, the debt ceiling, it's a statutory artifact. It shouldn't even be a thing. It's just a result of some old legislation that people had no idea it would be used in this manner. And we really have to get away from it. Both parties have threatened this in the past, but it's becoming a habit among the GOP right now. And we really have to get away from that and get on the hard work of governance, which involves negotiation, compromise, and realistic budget priorities. We might not have the same budget priorities across different political groups, but we need to be able to negotiate our budget priorities, come to a compromise. That is governance.
And you're talking about something that happened back in 1917 during World War I. And this was a bill that was passed that nobody ever thought that it would end up being used as a weapon, right? It's an antique and an anomaly.
It is an anomaly. And what it does is distract attention away from the real work of governance, which is creating a budget that we can enact into law altogether. Everyone has to work together. Like, no one party can do it by themselves. The American people have split governance in the federal government. They've split this across parties, and so we all have to work together.
But given how catastrophic it would be and what a self-inflicted wound this would be to our national security, who has the leverage here? Because somebody has to be an adult, and I assume at the end of the day the adult would have to be Biden if the Republicans just play hardball and do what former Republican Speaker John Boehner referred to as legislative terrorism. So who's got the leverage here, the terrorists or the adults?
I'm not sure the word leverage is relevant before there's a realistic alternative presented. So far, the alternatives presented seem to imply a 25% cut in spending across all categories, or if we protect defense, Social Security, Medicare, then it's going to involve, I've heard numbers 70% and 85% cuts across everything else. That's money for bridges, flood control, all kinds of things that people depend on every day. That would do quite a bit to our domestic security as well. So it's not clear whether a fully fleshed out, realistic proposal that's why you really have to talk about a budget as opposed to just that you don't want to raise taxes or just what you won't cut, but you want to cut everything out. Like, it's not really realistic the way all of these things are coming out unless you put it all into a budget, add up everything, and make sure that the total is something that you can live with and that's consistent with your commitment to reduce the national debt or the deficit, and the debt, and eventually the debt. So it's hard to it's hard to talk about leverage before there's any real counter proposal.
Well, his proposal does reduce the deficit and the debt, but we don't have one from the Republicans. That's the situation now, isn't it? Just in closing.
Yes, that's exactly what I mean by we don't see a counter proposal yet. So we don't know if any of the priorities that are being expressed by the Republicans in response to the White House budget are realistic or not. We won't know if they're realistic or not until we see them all written down, all the I's dotted, T's crossed in a full budget proposal. That's why a full budget proposal is necessary, so that you can see if all the numbers add up in what people are demanding.
Well, Katheryn Russ, I thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks to you, Ian. I'm just always so happy talking with you. I love your questions and your thoughtful analysis.
Well, thank you, Katheryn. And again, I've been speaking with Katheryn Russ, a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and a professor of economics at the University of California, Davis, who worked for the Obama administration's Council of Economic Advisors as a senior economist for international trade and finance. She is a faculty research associate in the National Bureau of Economic Research, International Trade and Investment Group, and has been a visiting scholar at the central banks of Germany, Portugal and France, and the Federal Reserve Banks of St. Louis and San Francisco. And she has an article at CNN, Republicans Are Playing with